Welcome to Artificial Evidence, the podcast where the algorithm knows. I'm your host, Owen Carver. Today we're stepping into the sterile glow of office lights, where ambition and greed twist into something far darker. This is the story of Brian Carlisle, a mid-level accountant whose seemingly mundane career led him down a rabbit hole of crime, corruption, and ultimately, murder. Brian Carlisle was the type of man you'd pass on the street without a second glance. In his late 30s, with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he fit the mold of every white-collar worker grinding away in downtown Pittsburgh. Brian worked for Rutherby & Finch, a mid-sized accounting firm occupying the 10th floor of a grey, glass-panelled skyscraper. It was a job that offered stability, decent pay, and a respectable place in the world. But for Brian, it wasn't enough. The story begins in early 2018, a year marked by corporate downsizing and increased pressure on employees to deliver results. Rutherby & Finch's biggest client, Millennium Development Group, was under federal investigation for suspected embezzlement. As one of the accountants tasked with reviewing Millennium's financials, Brian found himself at the center of a storm he didn't fully understand. One evening, while combing through spreadsheets in the dimly lit office, Brian discovered a discrepancy. A series of suspicious transactions funneled through offshore accounts. The sums were staggering, amounts that hinted at millions siphoned away in shadowy deals. But instead of reporting his findings, Brian hesitated. A simple choice, one click of his mouse, set everything into motion. By the following week, Brian had been approached by a man named Victor Delgado, Millennium's sharp-dressed legal consultant. Victor exuded charm and menace in equal measure. He'd somehow learned of Brian's discovery and offered him a deal. Keep quiet, and he'd be rewarded handsomely. Speak up, and things would get all complicated. Against his better judgment, Brian accepted. At first, the rewards were intoxicating. A substantial deposit appeared in his bank account, enough to pay off his mounting debts and then some. A few months later, Victor introduced Brian to new assignments. These weren't simple accounting tasks. They were money laundering schemes, thinly veiled as consultancy work. Each task drew Brian deeper into the web of Millennium's criminal enterprise. Brian's life outside work began to unravel. His wife, Sandra, noticed the changes, his late nights, his growing paranoia. He became withdrawn, snapping at her and their two kids over trivial matters. But Sandra's suspicions didn't matter to Brian. He was in too deep, and pulling out seemed impossible. By the summer of 2019, federal investigators were closing in on Millennium. A whistleblower from inside the company had come forward, providing enough evidence to issue subpoenas. Panic rippled through the ranks of Rutherby & Finch as the firm scrambled to cover its tracks. It was during this chaos that Brian's world came crashing down. One night he was summoned to a clandestine meeting in a downtown parking garage. Victor was there, flanked by two men who looked more like enforcers than accountants. They handed Brian a flash drive containing encrypted files and instructed him to erase any incriminating data from Rutherby & Finch's servers. Brian knew this was beyond anything he'd ever done. Deleting the files would implicate him in a federal crime, yet refusing could mean his life. Torn between fear and desperation, Brian complied. The files were gone by morning, but so was any semblance of safety he'd once felt. 2 weeks later, Victor Delgado was found dead in a luxury hotel suite, the victim of an apparent overdose. But investigators quickly ruled it a homicide. Traces of cyanide were found in his drink. The murder shocked everyone connected to Millennium, but for Brian, it was a wake-up call. If Victor wasn't safe, neither was he. The investigation into Millennium's activities intensified. Federal agents began interviewing employees at Rutherby & Finch, including Brian. His responses were measured, but the stress was unbearable. He started receiving anonymous threats, cryptic notes left on his car windshield, late-night phone calls with nothing but static on the other end. In October of 2019, Brian decided to flee. He liquidated his assets, emptied his savings, and disappeared. For 3 years he lived under the radar, moving between small towns and taking odd jobs to survive. But the past has a way of catching up. In early 2023, an investigative journalist named Lena Ward published an expose on Millennium's crimes. Her report included damning evidence implicating Brian Carlisle as a key figure in the money laundering operation. Within days, the FBI tracked him down to a cabin in rural Vermont. Brian was arrested without incident. During his trial, Brian's defense painted him as a victim, a man manipulated by powerful forces beyond his control. But the prosecution had a different narrative. They presented emails, financial records, and testimony from former colleagues, painting Brian as an opportunist who willingly participated in Millennium's schemes. The most shocking revelation came during the final days of the trial. Forensic analysts recovered the deleted files from Rutherby Amp, Finch's servers, revealing a hidden ledger. The ledger documented payments made to various individuals, including law enforcement officials, politicians, and even Victor Delgado. But one name stood out: Brian Carlisle. The payments to him were far larger than he'd admitted, suggesting he'd been more deeply involved than anyone suspected. Brian was convicted on multiple charges, including fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. To this day, questions linger about his true role in Millennium's empire. Was he a pawn or a willing participant? The answer may never be known. This has been another episode of Artificial Evidence. Join us next time as we uncover the secrets behind another labyrinthine case. I'm Owen Carver, and thank you for listening.